This is episode 123 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Adam G. Hooks, a professor of Shakespeare at the University of Iowa and author of Selling Shakespeare, Biography, Bibliography, and the Book Trade. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
We never even considered it was Richard III. It was just the first archaeological discovery of the project, and that was good news, but it wasn't surprising news. It wasn't really until that week later when we excavated the skeleton fully that was the exciting moment, when we sort of looked down and had the skeleton exposed and the curved spine and could see one of the head injuries, that we thought, hang on a minute, this can't be Richard III, but it sort of has to be Richard III. Who else could it be?
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
William Shakespeare immortalized Richard III as an ugly hunchback who is rudely stamped, deformed, unfinished, and cannot strut before a wanton ambling nymph. Those descriptions being quotes from Shakespeare's play titled Richard III. In doing so, Shakespeare encapsulated the Tudor opinion of Richard III and that of Shakespeare's 16th century theater audience, who loved to hear stories of the defeat of the House of Plantagenet by the House of Tudor. Shakespeare based his tales of Richard III, including sinister and evil acts, along with his bloody death at the Battle of Bosworth, on a mix of actual history, Holinshed's chronicles, and a great deal of personal creative license. One of the most enduring images Shakespeare uses of Richard III was that of a twisted spine to accompany Richard's ugly, twisted character. History scholars have long debated the source of this twisted spine. Was it scoliosis or maybe a hunchback? Without the actual body of Richard III, whose shallow grave was long lost to history centuries ago, scholars have used texts like Shakespeare to try and find evidence for the truth about what actually happened to Richard III. For one team of archaeologists, however, it was not enough to leave the sinister Richard III lost to history with more questions than answers. So in 2012, in conjunction with the Richard III Society, a team of ambitious archaeologists led by Mathew Morris at the University of Leicester Archaeological Services, working with the Leicester City Council, mounted an extraordinary effort to locate the final resting place of Richard III and discover the truth about his body, his death, and his grave. Remarkably, Mathew and his team did locate Richard III's body, and on the very first day of their project. Mathew Morris joins us today to share about this historical find, the truth about Richard III's twisted spine, and explain what one of the most notorious kings of England was doing buried beneath a car park. Mathew has worked for University of Leicester Archaeological Services since 2004, excavating a wide range of rural and urban archaeology across the Midlands from the prehistoric period through to the Industrial Revolution. He graduated from the University of Leicester in 2003 with a BA in archaeology and an MA in landscape studies. His interests include urban archaeology, community archaeology, and Roman and medieval archaeology. Notable projects include the High Cross Leicester retail development, a massive multi-period urban excavation investigating the northeast quarter of the Roman and medieval town, the Western Road Roman Cemetery in Leicester, work on Leicester and Oakham castles, and Leicester Greyfriars, as well as the first excavated section of the Lower Inknield Way at Aston Clinton in Buckinghamshire. In 2012, he supervised the successful archaeological search for the lost grave of King Richard III. He has co-authored 3 popular books on Leicestershire archaeology, Visions of Ancient Leicester, Richard III, the King Under the Car Park, and Life in the Roman World, Roman Leicester. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. Thanks for inviting me.
Two references contemporary to the life of William Shakespeare, one by Christopher Wren the Elder in 1612, and then John Speed in 1611, both call attention to Richard's death, but they seem to be confusing. Wren writes that a monument was erected to Richard III that would have potentially been visible to William Shakespeare unless it was torn down before then with the demolition of the friary. And then there's a rumor I came across that Henry VII placed a marble monument in the 15th century that could have also still been there for Shakespeare's lifetime. But then John Speed indicates the bones of Richard III were thrown into a river, which seems to have been given at least some credibility because 19th century historians erected plaques by this exact river as the site of Richard's last known remains, and even performed archaeological excavations there trying to find Richard's bones. Matthew, based on the historical records, what did Shakespeare likely believe had happened to Richard III as he wrote this play?
Yeah, there's a lot going on here, isn't there? And actually, before you asked, I'd never even thought about it in terms of Shakespeare being alive still at this particular point, which made me have to go back and check a couple of things, which is really interesting. So we don't actually know if Shakespeare ever visited Leicester. We know the King's Men played in Leicester in 1606, but that's long after the play was written. And we don't know if Shakespeare was still there with them at that point in travelling in Leicester. We know that Henry VII did erect a monument within the Church of the Greyfriars over Richard's grave 10 years after Richard's death. It was an alabaster monument, but it would have disappeared along with the church during the dissolution of the monasteries when the church was demolished in 1538. That's 20-odd years before Shakespeare was born, so it's unlikely he would have ever seen or had any real knowledge of that monument. There's no drawing of it surviving. All we know was it had an effigy of the king on it and a brass plaque with an inscription. In terms of the other two stories, and this is where the confusion about what happened to Richard's body came from, we have John Speed writing in 1611 this story about how during the dissolution, Richard's body was dug up by an angry mob of townsfolk and paraded through the streets and thrown off the bridge into the local river. That became a very popular story because his work was very popular, published across the kingdom, and as it was written down, of course, people then quoted him on it. The problem with it is that it was written 73 years after the events allegedly took place, and no other contemporary writers mention these events, despite spending quite a lot of time writing about Richard III, his burial, his grave, the tomb that was erected over the grave and so on, but make no mention of this story. So it seems probable that Speed made it up, or at least he's pulling together a load of folklore stories and turning them into a single narrative. And he's probably doing it to moralise. He's basically creating a story that is talking about how the inevitable fate of all things that are great, effectively. And so that brings us to the reference by Christopher Wren Sr., and he's writing a diary, and in it he writes about he's visiting a local resident in Leicester, a man called Robert Herrick, and he's shown round Herrick's garden, and he's shown this pillar in the garden that says, "Here lies the remains of Richard III, sometime King of England." And the wording on that pillar is unambiguous. Clearly, in Herrick's mind, who's erected this pillar, Richard is still buried somewhere under his garden. That's the year after Speed just had written that he'd been dug up and chucked off the bridge into the river. So this creates a lot of confusion, obviously, about exactly where Richard's remains are. The problem in terms of Shakespeare, though, is that Herrick's pillar in his garden was a private memorial in a private family garden, and Shakespeare would have only ever seen it if he'd actually been invited to stay by Herrick, and we have no knowledge of that. So going back to what Shakespeare would have known, I suspect all he knew was that the tomb had disappeared along with the church during the dissolution. I don't think there were probably at that point when he's writing the play in the 1590s, I don't think there was any real knowledge, certainly widely circulated knowledge of what had happened to Richard's remains after the church had disappeared. But yeah, it was an interesting question. I'd never thought about Shakespeare still being alive at that particular point.
As they were debating that. Yeah, and it's interesting. It seems like the through theme there is that nobody knows.
Well, yeah, that was right up to the point we started digging and breaking ground. No one knew. I mean, we had people shouting over the fence going, I don't know why you're digging there. My history book says he's in the river. We had a couple of irate authors who just published literally at the point we discovered it and couldn't retract. The books had already gone to print and couldn't retract what they'd written. And
oh, no.
What they published was he'd been chucked in the river, just as the news story was breaking.
That's always fun right there. That's like a publisher's nightmare, I think. Among so many impressive things with this dig, I think I remain shocked that you discovered his remains on the very first day that you started digging, which just makes me want to wave at the people over the fence and be like, thank you so much for your thoughts. But we know Richard III's body was buried in a shallow grave at Greyfriars Friary in Leicester. But Matthew, a site being demolished, as the friary was in the 1530s, often means historians never know for certain the precise location of graves like Richard III. Were you confident as you were beginning on that first day that you were digging in the right place, or was this a surprise for you too?
I think it'd be fair to say we weren't confident we would find Richard III. I mean, my boss infamously said he'd eat his hat if we found him, so something we never let him live down. But we were confident we would find the friary he was buried in. Which bits of it we didn't know. So we knew that from contemporary accounts of what happened to Richard, we knew he was buried in the choir of the Greyfriars Church at Leicester. That's never been disputed. So we had a location, we had a physical location that we could look for. We were looking for a church specifically, and within that church, the area of the choir. And so that would allow us to narrow the search down incrementally from sort of something large to something very small. So we're sort of narrowing the haystack down effectively. But all evidence of that friary has been lost effectively. There's a couple of street names left today. But what we were able to do was we were able to compare historic mapping with current mapping and extrapolate the site of the friary precinct, so we narrowed the search down effectively from an entire country to an entire city to an area that's sort of like the equivalent of a city block, basically. And we were then able to find areas within that city block to excavate. And we were pretty confident we'd find evidence of the friary. We were reasonably confident we'd find evidence of the church Richard was buried in, but finding Richard was just sheer luck.
Well, when you did find him, how was his grave different from other medieval graves in this area?
Finishing off the last question, I guess. We found him on the very first day. No, it's fine. I just realised I hadn't answered the question. I mean, yes, we found him within 6 hours on the first day, but of course we didn't know we'd found him at that point. We'd found his leg, basically. We knew we had a grave. We didn't know at that point whether the grave was in the church or where it was in relation to the friary. It took another week then of exploration to determine that grave was worth looking at closer as it was within the choir of the church. And as soon as we started excavating the grave, it did appear unusual. It seemed atypical for a grave that you would expect to see in one of the high status parts of a church, the choir of the church. It was poorly dug. It's difficult to tell whether it was hastily dug or whether it was just why it was dug. There was a lack of respect for the person in it or for whatever reason, but it was very poorly dug, so it was too short for the person buried in it. They'd had to prop the head up at one end. It was uneven sides, it was sort of irregular shaped, uneven base. There was no evidence of a coffin in the grave either, and that contrasted completely with other graves we'd encountered within the choir of the church, which were all large, neatly dug, rectangular graves, very neatly dug sides, and all other individuals that we've found so far were buried in coffins. So Richard was at one end, sort of the very poor end of the spectrum in terms of grave burial, whereas another person buried in that end of the church was buried in a lead coffin in a stone sarcophagus. So we had the two extremes going on, which really made the grave stand out as different.
I watched a video that's on the YouTube channel for this dig, and the video where you're finding this leg, it's like everyone is holding their breath going, oh, what have I found? and waiting to say, okay, don't touch anything. We've got to very carefully get this out. I can only imagine as you're pulling it out of the ground what you're thinking of going, okay, I've got to consider this just a person or just a grave as you're finding it until you can prove what it is.
Yeah, in some ways, it's because we found it on the first day, it wasn't that exciting a find, unbelievably. And we were looking for a church. We were expecting to find lots of human remains and lots of graves as well. So it was good news in that we'd found a grave. We must be getting nearer what we were looking for. But it seemed so improbable it could be Richard III. We never even considered it was Richard III. It was just the first archaeological discovery of the project, and that was good news, but it wasn't surprising news. It wasn't really until that week later when we excavated the skeleton fully that actually that was the exciting moment, when we sort of looked down and had the skeleton exposed and the curved spine and could see one of the head injuries, that we thought, hang on a minute, this can't be Richard III, but it sort of has to be Richard III. Who else could it be? So yeah, so it was sort of a building progress, really. It was in anticipation.
So you said it didn't really sink in for you till a week later when you're realizing what you have here. How did you actually determine that the skeleton you found was that of Richard III?
Yeah, so it took 5 months of scientific analysis to prove it was Richard III. I don't think any of us left site that day thinking we hadn't found him, but it took 5 months to prove it. Now, I guess it's important to say at the beginning that there's no single bit of evidence that proves it's Richard III. What you have to do is look at it like any detective case and look at the compilation of evidence, and that's what makes it so strong a case. So we know, for instance, that the skeleton was male, so the right gender. We know the person was in their early 30s when they died, so we know they're the right similar age to Richard, who was 32. We know from radiocarbon dating that the person died in the right period of history, although that's quite a broad period. It's 1450 to 1540.
And it is a graveyard that you're in, so...
It is a graveyard. There's a lot of young men of that age that would have died in that period of history. But then there's all the other evidence. So you've got the fact that the skeleton is buried in the right area of the Greyfriars Church, the choir. We've got the fact that the person had clearly died a very violent death. And then the real kicker, of course, is that the skeleton shares mitochondrial DNA with female line relatives of Richard III, and therefore has the same mitochondrial DNA as Richard III. So individually, none of that says it's Richard III. But when you bring it all together, it can't be anyone else. It's such a unique combination of information. It discounts every other suspect you could have alive at that time in history. So I think we worked it out. We were 99.999% confident it was Richard III.
Where did you get female mitochondrial DNA to match it with?
There's been a lot. Fortunately, Richard's the King of England, so his genealogy is well documented, of course, although that didn't make it an easy task. There was a historian called John Ashdown Hill that had, back in the early 2000s, managed to complete a family tree from Richard's oldest sister, Anne of York, to living relatives. A family called the Ibsens, who are Canadian, in fact, although Michael, the one we used the DNA from, lives in London. So they trace an all-female line of descent from Michael's mother all the way back to Cecily Neville, Richard's mother. Unbroken female line of descent, which means the mitochondrial DNA passes down intact from generation to generation, which means that Michael Ibsen, alive today, has identical mitochondrial DNA with Richard III, alive in 1485. And you can compare it to... It doesn't improve it's Richard III, but it proves that they're all related. And with all the other information taken together, it means the skeleton has to be Richard III.
That's a fun phone call to make or to receive. Excuse me, I need to borrow your DNA.
Yeah, and then a meeting in the car park where the first thing Turi King, the geneticist, asked him was to spit into a tube live on TV. So.
Never forget that day. So, well, now that you have the skeleton, what can you tell us about Richard III's spine? You alluded to this earlier, but is he indeed a sufferer of scoliosis or some other physical malformation like what Shakespeare describes?
He is, and actually this was the fascinating part of the story, because there's been a huge debate on whether the deformities that Richard III has in Shakespeare were entirely made up for propaganda purposes, or whether there is that kernel of truth behind them. So we found a skeleton with a curved spine, and the analysis shows that it is scoliosis. So it's not...
Score one for Team Shakespeare.
In part, at least, yes. So the important difference here is that it's not the hunchback that Shakespeare uses, which is more of a condition akin to kyphosis, that sort of forward-leaning hunch. This is a genetic condition that causes by abnormal bone growth on one side of the spinal process to force the spine to twist and rotate off in the opposite direction. So it creates a leaning to the side, basically. And John Rouse, a contemporary of Richard III's, got it right. He talks about Richard, describes him as having uneven shoulders, the right higher and the left lower, and that's exactly correct for the type of scoliosis Richard had. The way it's rotating would have lifted his right shoulder higher than his left shoulder. So there is this kernel of truth behind it. And it was a severe scoliosis. It would be something that would be surgically corrected today. The things that Shakespeare doesn't get correct or makes up are the fact that he describes it as Shakespeare having Richard having the condition from birth, which we know isn't true. It's an adolescent onset scoliosis. So it wouldn't have started manifesting until Richard was in his teens at the earliest. The other things that Shakespeare probably does entirely make up are the withered arm and the limp, effectively. The uneven legs, I think, is how he describes himself in Henry VI. Those things, there's no evidence on the skeleton whatsoever that there are. One arm is different to the other. Both arms are proportional to the rest of the skeleton. There's no evidence that he walked with a sustained limp either. We don't have the feet, unfortunately. They were the only bit missing, but there's no evidence on, say, the pelvis that suggests he was wearing or walking with a pronounced limp or anything, or that there was any issues with his legs. So there is this kernel of truth behind Shakespeare, which I guess is what all good propaganda does. It exaggerates something that is real for effect. And Shakespeare does it really well. And of course, the other Tudor writers do as well. So Moore and Holinshed and stuff, who sort of first bring it up. So I found that really fascinating.
Despite Shakespeare's influence on our current understanding of history, he was in fact writing drama. So inflating it was true to his industry there. So he can be forgiven at least somewhat. I have to ask though, why are the feet missing? Do you have theories on would they have been removed, or is this just a product of the fact that he was buried without a coffin for so long?
It's simply the fact that he's been buried out and the church was demolished and he's been in a garden for 500 years, and we could see that something had been dug through the legs. So it's probably a gardener that has unknowingly dug through the skeleton when digging a flower bed or something to that effect, probably.
Well, now, where you found him is really interesting to me, because a car park for our American listeners is the same as a parking lot. So, Matthew, why was there now a car park here, and why was the site not preserved?
So we can blame the Tudors for this, although not Henry VII, it's Henry VIII this time. Richard is buried within a Franciscan friary church, and that falls foul of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. So as soon as the Henry VIII's Court of Augmentations has stripped everything of value from the site and shut it down, the Crown sells the land on to private ownership. The church itself probably disappeared quite quickly. Some of the other buildings were probably hanging around in a ruined state for 20 or 30 years after that, slowly being robbed by the locals of the building stone to build their own houses with. So by the end of the 16th century, the site has been bought by Robert Herrick, the man who erected the pillar in his garden, and he builds a house in the friary precinct. And from then on, it passes down through the Herrick family until they sell the site on in the early 18th century. And new owners increasingly sell off bits of the garden, build new roads through it, new houses get built on the site, until slowly you just start losing all evidence of the original friary precinct. Today, there's only one lane left that's called Friary Lane. That's the only reference that there was something there in the vicinity. Until you get to the early 20th century, when all those houses become offices, because it's in the heart of Leicester, it's in the area that sort of becomes taken over by lots of solicitors, because it's very close to the courts. They all become offices, cars come along, suddenly all those solicitors need places to park their cars behind their offices, and so the garden spaces that remain get paved over and it becomes a car park. And by then, all evidence of the friary has completely disappeared. In our fair defence, when Richard III is not the only king we've lost over the years, though, so Henry I and Stephen are missing as well. Leicester just had the proud reputation of losing the church as well. So
it seems so amazing to me, and just sad or even embarrassing for him to have been a king of England who gets lost beneath a car park. But I think that does tell us something about how he was buried in the first place. Matthew, was Richard III buried in a disrespectful way originally? I mean, was he literally tossed aside?
That's really difficult to answer from the surviving archaeology in many respects. And in some ways, archaeology asks this question rather than answers it. So what we can say is that the manner of the grave indicated that Richard was buried, and we use the term minimal reverence, because what we can't say is why he was buried with minimal reverence, because we can't understand the mindset of the people burying him. So whether he was buried with minimal reverence because it was late August, it was a bit warm, and they needed to bury him in a hurry because he was in deteriorating condition, or whether it was because they didn't like him and just dug a hole and chucked him in it, or whether it was Henry VII's henchmen rather than the friars burying him and they just didn't know how to dig a grave. We don't know any of these bits of it. We can speculate about these bits. But what we can definitely say is, given that he was a king of England, and given where he was buried in the church, his grave was very atypical of medieval burials. And yeah, this minimal reverence, I think, he's buried with the most basic things achieved. So he would have had a funeral service. I don't think there'd have been no way they wouldn't have said a funeral mass over him. The friars, at the very least, after he was buried, would have done something. But yeah, it was very bare bones, just the bare minimum to get him buried, I think is fair to say.
Do we know whether or not Henry Tudor oversaw this process or had a role in it, or was this completely separate from him?
So we know that Richard's body was brought back from the battlefield with Henry VII's army, and that Henry VII spent 3 days in Leicester before he left for London. We know during that time Richard's body was put on display to prove to everybody he truly was dead. The accounts of the time then say when Henry left, Richard's body was then taken and buried in the Greyfriars. I don't think Henry VII would have left it to chance where Richard's body ended up. The very fact that if the body disappeared, you've then got the ability for pretenders to come along claiming that they're Richard III and that they never really died, and that never happened. So I think Henry would have been very specific about picking the Greyfriars. Whether he directly oversaw it or not, he must have picked the friary for a good reason. It might be because he had an affinity with the Franciscan order. He does seem to have been quite close to Franciscans, picked up during his time in exile in France. It might be that the Franciscans were known to take in and bury the executed aristocratic dead. So the aristocrats that had fallen from grace and wouldn't perhaps be buried elsewhere. It's possible that actually it's just as simple as it was a good secure location in the middle of Leicester and it was easy to keep an eye on the grave.
Shakespeare has Richard III cry, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," in Act 5, Scene 4 of the play Richard III, because in the play, Richard falls from his horse and then is murdered on the battlefield as a result of not being able to get a new horse. Historians now say that this line from Shakespeare misses the mark on a technicality, and that the real history is that the king did fall off his horse, but was in fact offered another horse. After declining the replacement, he was killed as a result of being on foot instead of on horse. Regardless of the historical accuracy of Shakespeare's immortalizing lines in the play, Matthew, are the injuries on the skeleton of Richard III consistent with his having been ruthlessly massacred on the battlefield?
That's probably a fair assessment, ruthlessly massacred, yeah. Actually, Shakespeare's pretty close on this one, I think. There were contemporary accounts of the battle, but they are all fairly bland and don't go into a huge amount of detail. And the way Shakespeare portrays the battle is pretty close to the sources that were available for it. From what we can tell, Richard III led a cavalry charge that came very close to killing Henry. Richard's credited as killing Henry's standard bearer, so he must have got very close. But the charge lost momentum, possibly got mired in marshy ground and trapped, possibly with his horse killed, possibly because his horse was stuck in the mud, we don't know. But yes, Richard ended up having to carry on fighting on foot and couldn't escape. And the injuries are very consistent with that. So the skeleton shows 11 sharp force injuries.
11?
9 to the skull, 11. And those are the ones that have gone deep enough to mark bones. So there's probably was a lot more soft tissue injuries as well. 9 of them are to the skull. The other interesting thing is that there are no defensive injuries. For someone to have suffered that much violence and not suffered any defensive injuries suggests that they are probably protected. They're wearing armour and it's doing a good job of protecting them elsewhere. So it looks like Richard was killed probably because he wasn't wearing his helmet. Now, whether that was because he'd deliberately taken it off, it had been ripped off in the battle and lost, or had been pulled off, we don't know. But it looks like the fatal blows are all to the head. And what we can tell is there's at least 3 or 4 different types of weapon involved, coming from multiple directions. So it looks like Richard is surrounded by multiple assailants who attack, bludgeon him to the ground, and it looks like from the angles of the blows, the 2 potentially fatal injuries were struck when he was already on the ground, either on his knees dropping forward or whether he was on face down on the ground already when he was actually killed. But yeah, it's a violent assault, but probably quite quick. It usually, when I do talks, it usually takes me a lot longer to explain how he died than it would have actually taken to kill him. The amount of injuries I've seen reenactors try and reenact it and have managed to hit some poor suspect in all the right places in 30 seconds. So it could be very quick. It might not have been quick, but it could be very quick. But definitely bloody. I think, is it Shakespeare's The Prophecy by Cecily Neville is bloody will be thine end? It's very true. It would have been a very bloody end.
Now, we've talked about how different Richard's grave was from the rest of the ones there at the Greyfriars. And I want to point out, though, just how significant it was that he was still there. I mean, not only was he minimal reverence, is that what the phrase I'm supposed to use? He was buried with minimal reverence, and he didn't have anything protecting his body from being lost entirely. And obviously, no one was being careful to not disturb the site where he was buried, and they didn't even know that it was there to care about it. How significant is it, Matthew, that you were not only able to find his remains, but that you found them intact, less his feet, of course?
I think given that he was buried in the Leicester city centre and has for 500 years had all sorts of building work going on over the top of him, we were incredibly fortunate that the only thing missing was his feet. In some ways, though, that his minimal reverence, archaeologically speaking, has protected the body. The fact that he wasn't buried in a coffin has meant that the bones were better preserved. So if you're buried in a coffin, you're basically being buried in a void in the ground. And when that coffin collapses, it has the potential to crush the skeleton. And so because he wasn't buried in it, the soil went directly over the body and instantly preserved it in the ground and cushioned it from later work. So archaeologically, we were helped with the poorness of his burial there. But the site has had a lot of activity going on it, and we're incredibly fortunate that he had survived. So the modern intrusions above him had come within 90 millimetres of his legs.
Wow.
So that's basically 2 more courses of brickwork, and we wouldn't have had anything left from the waist down of the skeleton.
That's incredible.
And the demolition of the friary had done significant damage in the area as well. And it's possible that the removal of the friary, the church tower, had come within a centimetre of his skull, the damage. So we're incredibly lucky. If we hadn't had the skull, we probably wouldn't have been able to identify him as successfully as we did.
Wow. Well, what's happened to his remains now that your project is concluded?
So the plan from the beginning was always to rebury Richard. So this was the idea that Philippa Langley, the instigator of the project, had, that she wanted to give Richard a more fitting end than dumped in the river. So the idea was always to rebury him in Leicester Cathedral. Once the analysis was done, we knew we'd have 1 or 2 years of a period of time to analyse and identify the skeleton. And then we always knew the remains would be reburied permanently. They wouldn't be kept for future studies. So that happened in 2015. So he's now got a brand new, nice, shiny tomb in Leicester Cathedral, which is only 100 metres from where he was originally buried. The cathedral, it's a modern designation, but it is a medieval church. It was the parish church of the parish he was buried in. So it was felt it was the most fitting place to rebury him. It was the nearest legal place that you could rebury human remains in the city centre, and it was the parish church for the church he was originally buried in.
Now, are there pictures and video of the find? Can people see pictures of his remains and somewhere posted online?
You can. I'm pretty sure if you just Google Richard III, the first thing that will pop up will be an image of the skeleton at some point. Yeah, so there's numerous books that have been written by all the different members of the team. I helped co-write one called Richard III, The King Under the Car Park, with my colleague Richard Buckley, who was the other lead archaeologist on the project. That you can get in most online retailers, I believe. But I think the best place to go for anything to do with the project would be the project's website. So that's www.le.ac.uk/Richard III. That's the University of Leicester's project page. And from there, you can find links to all the films that we've done, all the peer-reviewed articles we've done, all the other books that have been published, and all the links for all the other collaborators in the project. So the Richard III Society, for instance, and the visitor centre that's on site, and all the other things in Leicester to do with Richard III. That project page is probably the good go-to place to start learning more about the discovery.
Those are excellent resources for sure. Thank you for mentioning them. We will place links to all of these resources, including the books and films, and a couple of the YouTube videos that we found in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you check out those to find that. Now, Matthew, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
It's a really tough question. I have to say it's the toughest one today. Thinking about it, I mean, I feel it should link in with the conversation. And the one book that inspired me, I think, to be interested in Richard III, way before this project came along, was Josephine Tay's A Daughter in Time. But it's a very tiny, thin book. It wouldn't last very long on the desert island. So I'm cheating here and selecting something else, having plugged the first book. I think for something that would last me, I would have to go with Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which was published in the year 1485, so the year that Richard died at Bosworth. So it feels it's a fitting book on knights and chivalry and everything. It seems to be a book that Richard would have liked, I suspect.
Excellent choices. You'll be well set up on your deserted island for sure. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm trying to bring a new book to publication on the archaeology of Roman and medieval Leicester. And then finally, after that, we'll be able to fully publish the results for the Richard III project. But I'm a commercial archaeologist rather than an academic archaeologist. So what's next? That's always a big question. It's whatever the next building site might contain. And as we discovered with Richard III and other discoveries in Leicester, it might be absolutely nothing, but it might be the next King of England.
Well, at least you've got something fun around the corner. Mathew Morris, thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing with us about this historic find of King Richard III. It's been fun talking with you.
It was a pleasure.
To find links to the resources Mathew mentions in today's episode, as well as links to the YouTube videos from the University of Leicester, where you can watch as Mathew first uncovers the body of Richard III, be sure to check out today's show notes. Find all these resources at CassidyCash.com/episode 123. That's CassidyCash.com/EP123. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right! That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.